Hello.
Hey, Mario.
Oh. No, you don't go to Montana, no, it's cold.
It's cold.
Huh?
It's cold.
It's cold. Hmm. Oh. Oh. So where is everybody? Oh.
We supposed to be at 8?
Huh?
8?
8? Yes. It's 8:04. I think I'm gonna call Ernie. Hi, are we learning the Daf tonight? Oh, no, because it's past 8, that's why. Okay, all right. All right, thank you. Oh, Mr. Alange. Hi, Alan.
Hey, Mario, hello.
How are you?
Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. Good.
Chag Sameach, everybody.
Chag
Chag
Sameach,
Sameach,
Chag Sameach.
Freilich Chanukah. Okay.
56.
56, Nun Vav. Hanoider min habayis. Person takes a vow, I'm not going to go into a house. Mutter Baliyah, you can go into the second story. That's considered not the house, according to Rav Meir. The Chachamim Omer Aliyah b'chlal habayis. The Chachamim say the second story is part of the house, and therefore you would not be allowed to go into the second story. But if you made a specific neder hanoider min aliyah, mutter baboyis. If I'm not going to go into the aliyah, which always referred to the second story, that clearly distinguishes it from the ground floor. Therefore, you'd be allowed to go into. Bias is not part of aliyah. Aliyah, though, is part of bias. And that's what we've been seeing all along. A lot of this is semantics and phraseology based on common spoken custom at the time. So Montana Baboyis. Now, in the story of Goyim, it says Kanega Nirali Baboyis. Person says, I see a nega in my house. And that's a riboy, Baboyis. Le Raboyis is a yatzia. This is like a little bit of an upstairs, not a complete aliyah, but it's like a different elevation in the house. But that if you see a nega in that part of it, it's considered part of the bias. And babais l'rabais is aliyah. And babais means if you see a nega in the aliyah, it's considered that it's in the bias. And the Gemara is not going to offer Amrav Chizda Rab Meir. Rab Meir is the one who says that normally when you say the word bias, it doesn't include the aliyah. That's why in the Mishnah it said mutter bali. So that's why we needed a special ribui, baboyis, to include the aliyah, because just saying bias would not be enough to include the aliyah. So Rav Chizda wants to say that the brisa by Negoyim is also Reb Meir. The Rabbanan Ami Rabbanan Aliyah b'chlal habayis. Lama likra babayis l'ribuya. The Rabbanan already include the Aliyah when you say the word bayis. Doesn't need the ribuy of baboyis, because just by saying bayis you've included the Aliyah. So Abaya Amar Filu Temer Rabbanan. You don't have to say that the brisa is only Reb Meir, not Rabbanan. You still need, even if for the Chacham, you needed a kra, boy kra. When it introduces the concept of Negoim, it says the base eretz achuzaschem, and it emphasizes the word eretz. We might learn the mechaber ba'ara shmei bais, that which is directly connected to the ground. That's the bais, because the word eretz. Aliyah, the second floor, is not connected to the ground, at least not directly. It is halom mechaber ba'ara. And therefore, I would have thought, even according to Chachamim, that it's not metame, that it's not considered part of the bias, even though normally in language, the Chachamim would include the aliyah when you say the word bias. So therefore, even the Chachamim needed the drasha of babois. Okay. The Gemara gets out of that problem. The Gemara also is now going to want to learn that the following statement is also maybe only Rab Meir or only the Chacham. When a person is selling his house and he says, "Bayis bevesi ani moichelacha," I'm selling you a house within my house. So Mareu Aliyah, he can claim after the transaction goes down that what he was selling was the attic, was the second floor. That's what he meant by bayis bevesi. But that only worked because he used that language bayis bevesi. Aval bayis stam, Einam Aliyah, Lema Reb Meir he. So again, the Gemara wants to say maybe Reb Meir is the one in our Mishnah who said that an Aliyah is not considered part of the bayis. So maybe with the way we're being medayik this other case, that when you just say bayis stam, it doesn't include the Aliyah. That's only Reb Meir. Because the Chachamim hold that when you say the word bayis, it includes the Aliyah.
It's unreal. Am I?
Afilu Tema Rabbanon. We can say that that statement is also according to Chachamim. Because he wasn't referring when he said the word aliyah to a second story. He was referring to Mu'ulush Babati. He was saying, I'm going to sell you a very fine house, a very special house, or the best part of the house. Not necessarily referring to the second story. Mishnah. Hanoidim in Amita Mutter Bedargash. We're going to see at great length what a dargash is. Dargash was some kind of ceremonial bed that really wasn't sat on, like a decorative place that you sat on, but no one really sat on it. So if you take a neder, I'm not going to sit on a bed, on a mita, mutter b'dargash, you'd be able to sit on a dargash. A dargash is not considered b'chlal a mita. No, they again disagree and say when you use the word mita, it includes a dargash. Now, everybody holds on noidim and a dargash, mutter b'mita. Dargash is very specific. You'd be permitted to sleep on a bed. Now, what is this dargish? My dargish. Amr Ula Arsa de Gado. It's a mazel bed. They would put this thing in the house for mazel. For COVID, there was decorations on it. Like the Meforshim say, every house has a sar that is mamun on the bias. So they put a mita for this sar, the malach. It's like a kosher elio. The shita meant to compare that set. Says it's not avodah zora, like he says, it's like we do a kisei shalelio by a mila. Armele rabbanon leula hadisnan. So the Chachamim have a problem with this. When they talked in Hilchas Avelis, especially in Avelis by a king. So there was something called the Suda Savra. When you came back from the funeral, they ate a very hefty Suda. All the people were on the ground. Who makes of Allah dargish? And he sat on this dargish. So I understand. So you're telling me that the dargish normally is something that people normally don't sit on at all. And on the day of his Avelis, Ahu Yom Yosef Alei. So Maski for Ravina. Ravina says, what do you mean? That's not a problem. When it comes to eating meat and wine, a melech kulashata iboy achel v'boy lochel. He has a choice. But hahu yama anon yavinan lay. Today we bring him meat and wine for the Suzada Dafka. So perhaps the same din applies by a dargish. Well, you want to have a problem, Elah Kasha, I'll show you the other kasha they asked about a dargish, the time. Dargish, loya kofeil azoikfun. By Avelis, all the beds were overturned, upside down. A dargish, they didn't do it. They just sort of put it upright against the wall. Now, the Iamrit Arsa the Gadu, if you're going to tell me that the Dargish is this mazel bed, you overturn every bed, even ones you don't sleep in. So why wouldn't he turn over and flip over the Dargish? Where says that haloi kasha? This is there were certain beds that they put objects on, and that's treated differently. The Tanya Maisa mita miuchedes lekelim, and not for sleep. Ain't tzarich lekafel. So a mazel bed also would be in the same category. Okay, so but there was a Masora, obviously, that there was some kasha regarding Dargish. And right now, we've been able to be metaritz all the kashas. Elai kasha hakasha, the Tanya. Rav Shimon Gamliel Oimer, Dargish, matir, the Ovel doesn't flip it over. Ela matir karvitov, a Dargish was like a hammock in a sense. It had strings that tied the, whatever you sleep on, like a canvas, was tied, and there was a frame of wood, like a rectangle, and the ropes tied that what you lied on to the frame, and they would untie the ropes and would fall down. The Dargish arsa the Gadu, and if a Dargish is this mazel bed, karvit miisle, the Dargish didn't have these kind of ropes. Ki asa ravin, Omar shiltiu lahum rabbanon. I asked the Chacham Rav Tach Chlifa bar Marav Shmei Tavishchich b'Shuka Ditzali. He was he was in the market of leather goods. I guess this was made out of leather. Formerly, my Dargish Arsa Ditzalo was a bed made out of leather, and not a mazel bed. And that seems how the Gemara ends. And then it was strung with string around to the wooden frame. Itmar, Eza Mita Vezu Dargish. There's actually a brisa. What's a bed? What's a Dargish? Amrav Yemit, Mita Misragin Osal Gabo. So, the Mita was where the ropes were tied around on the outside of the frame. But Dargish Misragin Migufo, they would drill holes in the frame, and the strings were placed within the hole so they didn't go on the outside of the frame. That's the difference between a bed and a Dargish. Meisvei, we ask a kasha on this. Kli eitz, a wooden kli. When, a kli has to be finished in order for it to be makabel tumah. So the Gemara wants to know eitz, me'emes makabel tumah. When does a kli eitz become makabel tumah? And it goes through different kelim. So hamita varisa, a bed in a crib. Mishishufam ba'oradan. They used to take the skin of a fish that was scaly, and they would use it as sandpaper. So until you sand the wooden kli, it's not a finished kli. If you have ropes wrapping around by a mita around the wood, if there's ropes all the way around, you don't see the wood because it's covered by ropes. And why would you need to sand it? So it comes out, Ella, havaha is migufan. You drill holes inside of it, and the ropes are put in there, and therefore the outside wood is seen, and that's why there's a need to sand it. Therefore, we tried to make a distinction between a mita and a dargish by saying one has ropes through the holes and one does not. Now we've rejected that. So now we need a different distinction. Mita a'uli vafuki bebizni. So you string the strings through the hole in the wood. Dargish a'uli vafuki bavakta. There were other knots that you tied to those knots. So you didn't, and you just undid those and it fell, rather than dealing with the wood. So those knots were there permanently in the holes. That's the difference. It's a structural difference between a mita and a dargish. Ari Agabarach Amar Rebbe mita shenal kita mita shenilkata yoitzin. So zoikva v'dayim. The way this bed was constructed, you can't really flip it upside down. So it's enough to put it on its side, and that's enough. We're talking about by Avelis. Regarding this, how you flip the dart. Ishna.
Doesn't the way the Kabbalah is when a person has a machshava when he finishes a keli, doesn't it have to do with that rather than the physical thing? He decides I'm finished. Once he says I'm finished, because he can want to do something else with it. Isn't that when it was Roy Kabbalah?
There are instances where a person's machshava will determine that the kli is finished. But there are also instances where the Gemara will go through the Gedorim that if you do such and such physical action to the kli, you're done. So it's not to the exclusion of that. There are times where a person will say, okay, like for example, you have a raw piece of canvas. Well, if he decides I'm going to use that to sit on, so it's a kli. So that's where that comes in. A person's machshava will determine that even you might think it's unfinished, but if he designates it for a certain use based on his machshava, then it's already considered a kli. That's what you're thinking about. And there are cases where the Gemara has where that's considered a kli, but it's not in every kli. In other kelim, the Gemara goes through physical processes that say, okay, once you do this, the kli is finished. Mishnah. Hanoidim in ear. Person says, I'm taking that, I'm not going to walk into the city. Mutter lekanis l'tchum shel ir. You can end, tchum is 2,000 amas around. So the tchum is not considered the city, but the osr lekanis ibura. Ibura is within 70 amos of the city. That's considered already the city. Now, aval hanoidim in abayis osr min ha'agav lifni. If you take a neder against walking into a house, the agaf is like the door frame. There you can't even go into the door frame. From the door frame in. Now, minolan dibur demasa kamasa dami. How do you know that the 70 amas close to a city is considered like the city? Right? The pasuk says Yehoshua was in Yericho. My Yericho. Nobody could get into Yericho. It was closed down. He was within 70 amas. Maybe he was within 2,000 amas. So the Gemara says, "Aksiv betchuma umadosem michutz la'ir." There in the Torah, where it describes alpayim bama, that's clearly described as chutz la'ir, and not part of the ear. So the tchum is definitely not part of the city, but the ipura, based on the pasuk of Bios Yehoshua B'Yericho, is a proof that as long as you're in 70 amas of the city, you're in the city. Anoidim in abayis, eina oisra l'menagaf lifnei, aval menagav l'chutz lo. So from the door frame out, it's not the bayis. So Mosif Rav Mary. We're going to ask kashas again from the Hilchos Nagoyim by a house that's afflicted with a nega. It says V'yatsa kohen min habayis el pesach habayis v'hizgiris habayis. That's the process of the kohen declaring that this bias is a base menuga. Yachol yelech lebeis v'yazgir. Does he have to go home? No. He just has to be in front of the bias. Maybe he can stand under the door lintel and be mazgir there. So that's considered still min habayis. So you have to leave that area. So this is already, we can see the kasha. Because previously we said, Hanoidim min habayis, you cannot be min ha'agaf v'lifnim. But from these psukim in the goyim, it seems that the lintel is considered outside of the bias. So Hakate said, Oy made bitzad hamashko v'yazkir. So he stands outside on the side of the door frame. The Yazgir, that's where he does the Hasgara. Let's say he went to his house and he was Mazgir there, or he stood under the lintel and he was Mazgir. Shehezgero Muskir. That b'di'eved it would work. That means even though lechatchila that's not what he should have done, but it works. So it sounds like as long as he's under the mashkov, he's considered like he's in the house. So why does it say you're only osir min ha'agaf v'lifnim? It should be osir even under the lintel. Shiny gabi bayis t'chsiv min habayis. You can't learn from the goyim. There it says clearly got to leave the bias. Achi min habayis kulo. But by neder, you don't have to, it's not as stringent.
Yeah.
By Yericho, if it was a walled city, what was the 70 amos referring to? Outside the walls?
Outside the walls.
So that's still considered part of Yericho then, huh?
Yes.
Oh. And
Technically it's considered inside the ear.
and the same thing, the Nechum would be outside the